That morning at the airport, my son texted me to say the plans had changed. I was not coming on the Mediterranean cruise. His wife wanted only her family, and they had given my ticket to her brother. The very next day, I canceled their credit cards, sold the estate right out from under them, and left the state. When they returned from Europe expecting luxury, they found a towering chain-link fence and a commercial bulldozer parked on their perfectly manicured lawn. Here is exactly how you demolish a betrayal. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old, and for 4 decades I worked as a general contractor in the suburbs of Boston. I am a man built on calluses, poured concrete, and freezing early mornings. I spent my entire adult life framing houses for strangers, breaking my back so that I could build a secure, unshakable foundation for my own family. But sitting in the Delta terminal at Boston Logan Airport that crisp Tuesday morning, holding a worn leather duffel bag across my lap, I realized that the foundation I had poured for my only son was entirely rotten. I had arrived at the airport 3 hours early. That is just how I am wired. 40 years in the construction business teaches you that if you are on time, you are already late. The terminal around me was a symphony of ordinary chaos. Automated announcements echoed over the loudspeakers, rolling suitcases clattered against the polished tile floors, and happy families embraced near the ticketing counters. I watched them with a quiet, contented smile, eagerly anticipating my own family's arrival. This trip was supposed to be a monumental milestone. It was my 70th birthday, and to celebrate, I had paid $45,000 out of my own pocket for a 14-day Mediterranean luxury cruise. We were going to see Rome, Athens, and Barcelona. I wanted to see my son Tyler and his wife Megan finally relax. I wanted to watch my grandchildren discover the world. I wrote that massive check without a single second thought, because at my age, you learn that money is just a tool to buy time with the people you love. I checked my silver wristwatch. Tyler was supposed to pick me up at the passenger drop-off zone 20 minutes ago. I assumed there was heavy traffic on the interstate, as there always is in Boston. I took a slow sip of my lukewarm black coffee and waited patiently. Then my phone buzzed heavily in my chest pocket. I pulled it out, fully expecting to swipe answer and hear Tyler's voice telling me he was pulling up to the curb. It was not a phone call. It was a text message. A short, dry string of words that would shatter my reality into a million unrecoverable pieces. I put on my reading glasses and stared at the glowing screen. The words felt completely disconnected from reality. Dad, plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise. Megan is stressed out, and she wants only her blood family on this trip. Your ticket was transferred to her brother. Just go home. We will talk when we get back. I read the message once. Then I read it twice. Then a third time. I did not drop the phone. I did not cry out. And I did not weep. If you are watching this video right now, I want you to take a deep, grounding breath. Have you ever poured your entire life savings, your sweat, and your unconditional love into your family, only to be discarded at an airport terminal with a cowardly text message? If you have ever felt the stinging slap of a betrayal like this, please tell me which state or country you are listening from and what time of day it is for you. It brings a lot of comfort to an old man to know I am not speaking into a void. As I sat on that rigid metal bench, the surrounding noise of the busy airport seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. My chest tightened, not with sorrow, but with the cold, pragmatic assessment of a builder finding a fatal structural flaw. I thought about my late wife, Diana. God, I missed her deeply in that moment. Diana passed away 4 years ago from a sudden, aggressive cancer. When she died, the silence in our beautiful marital home became absolutely deafening. The walls felt too far apart. The memories were simply too heavy to bear alone. Tyler knew I was struggling with the crushing loneliness. He approached me a year after her funeral with a brilliant proposition. He told me they had found a magnificent property, a sprawling $1.8 million estate. It had a massive main house and a small separate guest house in the backyard. "Let us all live together, Dad," he had said, looking me right in the eye with complete sincerity. "You will be close to the kids. You will never be alone again. I believed him. I sold the dream home Diana and I had meticulously restored with our own hands. I took the entire proceeds of my life's work and funded the purchase of their estate in full. $1.8 million paid entirely in cash. I did not even ask for a simple thank you. When we moved in, Megan immediately claimed the sprawling custom-built main house. She quickly relegated me to the 600-square-foot drafty guest house in the back. I accepted it without a single word of complaint. I reasoned that young couples needed their space to breathe. I just wanted to be near my blood. But as I stared at the text message in the terminal, the scattered pieces of the puzzle began to violently snap together. I looked at the specific phrasing Tyler used. Your ticket was transferred to her brother. My hands, thick and permanently scarred from decades of swinging heavy hammers and gripping rough lumber, gripped the edge of the metal bench. I am not a foolish man. You cannot simply transfer a multi-thousand-dollar international cruise ticket to another person 12 hours before departure. An international maritime manifest requires strict passport verifications, security clearances, and weeks of bureaucratic processing. This was not a sudden last-minute change of heart, because Megan was feeling a little stressed. This was a calculated, premeditated theft. They had planned this for weeks, smiling straight to my face, eating the expensive dinners I bought them all, while coordinating in the shadows to steal the vacation I paid for and give it to her pretentious family. They thought I was just a clueless, tired old man who would shuffle back to his tiny guest house, hang his head in defeat, and wait quietly for them to return so I could buy them a welcome home dinner. They severely underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I stood up from the bench. I grabbed the heavy canvas handle of my duffel bag. I did not feel like a helpless victim. I felt the cold, sharp focus of a contractor who realizes a building is too corrupt to be salvaged. When you find black mold creeping through the walls and termites destroying the foundation, you do not try to patch it up with a fresh coat of paint. You bring in the heavy machinery. You tear it completely down to the dirt. I pulled out my phone. I was not going to let him hide behind a cowardly text message. I navigated to Tyler's contact and pressed the call button, raising the phone to my ear as I walked purposefully toward the terminal exit. The dial tone rang in my ear, matching the heavy, steady rhythm of my footsteps. It was time to hear his voice, to listen to the pathetic lies he had prepared, and to begin the total demolition of my son's perfect, stolen life. The phone rang 3 times before he finally picked up. I could hear the distinct, chaotic background noise of Terminal E. The muffled voice of a gate agent announcing a boarding zone, the squeak of rolling luggage wheels on the hard floor, the low hum of hundreds of travelers rushing to their gates. Dad, listen. I am so sorry. Tyler's voice was tight, breathless, carrying that familiar, panicked pitch he always got when he was trying to smooth over one of his wife's unreasonable demands. I know this is incredibly messed up, but you have to understand the situation we are dealing with right now. I kept my voice completely level. I gripped the handle of my bag and simply said, "Explain it to me, Tyler. Help me understand why I am standing at Logan Airport with a packed bag for a Mediterranean cruise I paid for while you are boarding a plane with your brother-in-law." He let out a heavy sigh, sounding like a man carrying the weight of the world. It is Megan's parents' dad. Richard and Patricia had a massive, explosive fight last night. They are talking about a divorce. It is really bad. Megan has been crying since 2 in the morning. She is having a complete emotional breakdown. She said she desperately needs a healing, intimate space with just her blood relatives right now. She needs her family to be together to process this trauma without anyone else around. It is not about you, Dad. I promise. We just had to give the ticket to her brother so he could be there to support her and her parents. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. The plausible lie. It was delivered with such practiced desperation that a lesser man, a softer father, might have actually felt a pang of sympathy. But I knew the dynamics of this family better than anyone. I knew the players. Tyler had possessed a fatal flaw since he was a young man. He was fundamentally weak when it came to seeking approval, especially from people who considered themselves above him. When he married Megan, he did not just marry a woman. He married into a desperate illusion of upper-crust society. Richard and Patricia were the textbook definition of faux wealth. They drove leased luxury cars they could barely afford, wore designer clothes bought on high-interest credit cards, and constantly spoke about their prestigious country club memberships. They treated my son like an unpaid intern, a commoner, who was lucky to be allowed in their presence. And Tyler, eager to please, bent over backwards to accommodate their every whim. He became a doormat, completely willing to sacrifice his own dignity, and apparently his own father, just to keep Megan and her pretentious parents satisfied. "Dad, are you there? Please do not make a scene about this." Tyler begged, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I know you spent a lot of money, and I know it is your 70th birthday. I feel terrible, I really do. But I have to support my wife. When we get back to Boston, I will make it up to you. I will take you to that high-end steakhouse downtown, the Capitol Grill. Dinner is entirely on me. Just please take a taxi back to the guest house and let us handle this family crisis. Dinner is entirely on me." The phrase almost made me laugh out loud. I knew perfectly well that any dinner he paid for would ultimately be funded by the generous monthly allowance I secretly slipped into their joint account to keep their mortgage from going underwater. I did not yell. I did not demand to speak to Megan, and I certainly did not beg for the ticket that rightfully belonged to me. I knew that arguing with a fool only makes you look foolish. "Take care of your wife, Tyler," I said, keeping my tone perfectly smooth, betraying absolutely zero emotion. "I hope Richard and Patricia figure out their marital issues. Have a safe flight." I hung up the phone before he could say another word. I did not want to hear his relieved sigh. I did not want to hear him tell Megan that the clueless old man had swallowed the excuse without putting up a fight. I turned my back on the ticketing counters and walked through the sliding glass doors out into the crisp morning air. The Boston wind hit my face cold and sharp. I stood at the designated rideshare pickup zone and requested a car. As I stood there waiting on the concrete curb, my contractor's intuition began to gnaw at the back of my mind. It was a familiar sensation. It was the exact same feeling I used to get when I walked onto a job site, looked at a freshly framed wall, and just knew, without measuring, that a load-bearing beam was completely off-center. Something in the math did not add up. Tyler claimed that Richard and Patricia had their massive blowout fight last night. He claimed Megan had been crying since 2 a.m, prompting the sudden, desperate decision to swap my ticket for her brother's. But I have traveled extensively throughout my life. I know how the logistics of international travel work. You cannot simply walk up to a cruise line ticketing agent 12 hours before a ship sets sail from a European port and transfer a fully booked high-security reservation to another passenger. International maritime law, homeland security protocols, and customs manifest requirements are incredibly strict. Changing a name on a luxury cruise cabin requires sending passport copies, updating security databases, and paying administrative transfer fees days, if not weeks, in advance. The cruise line would never allow a spontaneous ticket swap at 3 a.m. on the exact day of departure. The realization washed over me cold and heavy. This was not a spontaneous reaction to a sudden family crisis. This was a meticulously planned operation. They had known for a long time that I was not going on that trip. They had contacted the cruise line, submitted her brother's passport information, and paid the transfer fees well in advance. They had let me pack my bags, lay out my medications, and drive to the airport fully knowing I was going to be turned away at the curb. Megan had orchestrated this hit, and my son had willingly played his part, feeding me a fabricated story about a marital crisis to keep me docile and compliant. A black sedan pulled up to the curb. The driver rolled down the window and confirmed my name. I tossed my duffel bag into the trunk and slid into the back seat. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I gave him the address of the $1.8 million estate in the suburbs. As the car merged onto the highway, leaning into the steady flow of morning traffic, my mind raced through the implications of this deception. Why would they go through such an elaborate, cruel charade just to bring her brother on a trip? Why not just ask me to buy him a ticket? I had the money. I would have gladly paid for it to keep the peace. Unless the trip itself was not the main objective. Unless keeping me occupied packing my bags and getting me out of the house was just a smokescreen for a much larger, darker scheme. They needed me to believe I was going away. They needed me to be distracted, confused, and eventually safely isolated back in my small guest house, thinking I was doing them a noble favor by giving them space to heal. They thought they had successfully neutralized me, but they had made a severe miscalculation. When you try to bury a man who has spent his entire life digging in the dirt, you are only handing him the shovel. I was not heading back to the quiet, isolated guest house to lick my wounds. I was going straight into the massive main house, the house my money had built, the house they had left completely empty. I was going to pull back the drywall of their perfect upper-class life and see exactly what kind of rot was hiding underneath. The black sedan glided onto the interstate, leaving the chaotic hum of Logan Airport behind. I settled into the deep leather seat and watched the gray city skyline pass by the tinted window. My breathing was slow and steady. In my line of work, panic is a completely useless emotion. Panic makes you rush, and rushing makes you miss the critical structural faults. I needed to see the faults clearly. I reached into my heavy canvas jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I might be 70 years old, but I am not technologically illiterate. When you manage multi-million-dollar construction contracts for 40 years, you learn to adapt to modern banking systems. I opened my banking application and used my thumbprint to bypass the security screen. I scrolled past my primary checking and savings accounts, navigating directly to the credit accounts. I was looking for a specific piece of plastic. 6 months ago, I had given Tyler a secondary card linked to my personal Platinum account. I told him explicitly that it was only to be used for genuine emergencies while traveling. A medical issue, a lost passport, a sudden need to rebook a flight. I wanted him to have a reliable safety net while they were in Europe. I tapped on the Platinum account to view the recent transactions. The digital screen loaded, and a wave of icy clarity washed over my entire body. The current balance was not zero. The pending charges sat at exactly $15,420. I narrowed my eyes, squinting at the small text on the screen, feeling the familiar tightening in my jaw. I clicked on the itemized list, expanding the transaction history. The charges were not from an emergency room. They were not from an embassy or a last-minute hotel booking due to a missed flight. The largest charge was a direct payment to the cruise line for $8,000. The description clearly read first-class cabin upgrade and priority boarding. Right beneath that was a charge for $3,000 at a luxury maritime excursion agency booking private vineyard tours and exclusive wine tastings in Tuscany. And below that, another massive charge for the onboard wellness center. $2,500 for couples massage therapies, thermal suite access, and premium spa treatments. I clicked further into the digital receipts, expanding the billing details. The booking names were clearly listed in plain text. Richard and Patricia. Megan's parents. They were the recipients of the flight upgrades. They were the ones booked for the exclusive wine tours. They were the ones scheduled for the couple's massages. I stared at the screen as the final, most damning detail crystallized in my mind. The transaction dates. These charges had not been made at 2 a.m. during a sudden, tearful family breakdown. They had been posted to the account 3 weeks ago. 3 entire weeks. While Tyler and Megan were coming over to my tiny guest house eating the warm dinners I cooked for them, and smiling directly to my face about how excited they were for our family trip, they were actively draining my credit line. They were using my emergency safety net to fund a lavish 5-star vacation for her pretentious parents. They had stolen my money to upgrade the very people who constantly looked down on me. The sheer audacity of the theft was breathtaking. It was a calculated, cold-blooded extraction of my resources. Tyler had stood in my kitchen just yesterday, looking me directly in the eye and told me how much he was looking forward to seeing Rome with me. He had already given my ticket away. He had already spent $15,000 of my money to make sure Richard and Patricia traveled in absolute luxury. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I did not feel a single drop of sadness. Sadness is for when you lose something valuable. I had not lost a son today. I had discovered a parasite. I realized that my son had morphed into a spineless accomplice to his wife's endless greed. He was terrified of losing Megan's, terrified of displeasing her demanding family, so he had offered up his own father as a financial sacrifice. He thought I was just a walking teller machine, a blind bank account that would accept any flimsy excuse as long as he sounded apologetic enough on the phone. He believed my fatherly love would blind me to his blatant financial abuse. He thought my desire for family harmony would override my basic common sense. He assumed that because I remained quiet, I was simply ignorant. He forgot that a quiet contractor is usually just taking precise measurements. The Uber turned off the main highway and navigated the winding tree-lined streets of the upscale suburban neighborhood. We passed massive properties with iron gates and pristine landscaping. Finally, the car slowed and pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of my estate. The $1.8 million property sat quietly in the morning sun. The driver put the car in park and popped the trunk. I thanked him, tipped him in cash, and retrieved my heavy duffel bag. As the sedan reversed down the driveway and disappeared from sight, I stood alone on the manicured cobblestone. I looked straight ahead at the sprawling main house. It was a magnificent piece of architecture. 3 stories of stone and glass, custom mahogany double doors, and a beautiful wrap-around porch. It was the house I had purchased outright, with zero financing, using the money Diana and I had saved our entire lives. Then I turned my head and looked toward the back of the property. Barely visible behind a row of tall privacy hedges was the guest house. It was a simple, single-story structure, modest and unobtrusive. That was where I had been living for the past year. That was where I was supposed to go right now. I was supposed to drag my luggage up the narrow concrete path, unlock my cheap hollow core door, and sit in silence while they spent my money in the Mediterranean. I was supposed to wait patiently for a pathetic steak dinner as compensation for missing the trip of a lifetime. I gripped the thick handle of my bag. I was not going to the guest house. I turned my heavy work boots back toward the main house. I walked up the wide brick steps to the front porch. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy brass spare key they had given me for extreme emergencies. I stood before the polished mahogany doors. If they were bold enough to steal $15,000 from my credit card and lie directly to my face for 3 continuous weeks, there was absolutely no logical limit to what else they were hiding behind these expensive walls. I inserted the brass key into the cold metal lock. The deadbolt clicked open with a heavy, satisfying sound. I pushed the door open. It was time to pull back the drywall of their perfect upper-class life and see exactly what kind of rot was hiding underneath. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside the suffocating silence of the main house. I stood in the grand foyer, letting my eyes adjust to the immaculate, sprawling space. The air in here always smelled faintly of expensive eucalyptus diffusers and polished leather. It was a stark, jarring contrast to the damp, drafty air of my 600-square-foot guest house located just a few dozen yards away across the perfectly manicured lawn. In my modest living quarters, the walls were bare. The furniture consisted of a few practical pieces I had kept from my old life with Diana, and the floors were simple, cheap laminate. Here, however, every single inch of the open floor plan screamed of excessive, unearned wealth. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my heavy work boots thudding softly against the imported Italian marble tiles. I had paid for these tiles. I had paid for the grand crystal chandelier hanging above my head. I had paid for the pristine, custom-woven rugs that graced the formal living room floor. As I walked deeper into the house, passing the massive dining room that they used exactly twice a year to host Megan's pretentious friends. My contractor's eyes automatically scanned the craftsmanship. I ran my calloused, scarred hand along the edge of the custom wainscoting, lining the long hallway. I remembered the exact weekend I installed it. My knees had ached terribly, a sharp grinding pain that comes with 70 years of hard physical labor, but I had pushed through the agony because Tyler had asked me for a favor. Megan wanted the house to look like something out of an upscale architectural magazine, and I, desperate to buy my way into my daughter-in-law's good graces, had eagerly volunteered my decades of professional expertise. I spent 3 grueling weeks reframing their living room, installing a state-of-the-art floating staircase and building out the massive gourmet kitchen. I worked from dawn until dusk, breathing in drywall dust and enduring the sharp, relentless ache in my lower back, simply wanting to build a beautiful, sturdy nest for my son and his future children. I stepped into that very kitchen now. The vast quartz countertops gleamed perfectly under the modern recessed lighting. I remembered installing the custom cabinetry, carefully leveling each heavy wooden door so it shut with a satisfying soft click. During those 3 weeks of backbreaking labor, Megan had never once offered me a single glass of water. She had never once asked if I needed to take a break, or if my aging joints were hurting from the constant bending and lifting. Instead, she had treated me exactly like a hired day laborer who was taking too long on a job site. She would walk into the kitchen holding a cup of gourmet coffee, point a perfectly manicured finger at a fresh molding joint, and complain that the white paint was not exactly the specific shade she had envisioned. Not once in those 3 weeks, nor in the months that followed, did the words "thank you" ever cross her lips. I had rationalized her cold behavior at the time. I told myself she was just particular about her home. I told myself that providing for my family, even if they were exceptionally ungrateful, was simply the burden a father must silently bear. I had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into their joint bank accounts to fund this designer lifestyle, writing check after check to cover their extravagant tastes, fully convinced I was buying family unity and ensuring my son's happiness. I thought my financial sacrifices were the strong mortar holding our fragile family dynamic together. But standing in that silent, flawless kitchen, the illusion completely evaporated. The house did not feel like a home anymore. It felt like a museum built entirely on the foundation of my own foolishness and desperate desire for connection. They had taken my life savings, my physical labor, and my quiet need for family, and they had used it all to construct a monument to their own vanity. I turned away from the gleaming kitchen island and walked down the wide corridor toward the back of the house. I was not here to admire the crown molding or mourn the unappreciated labor. I was here to inspect the foundation. I was here to find the hidden structural damage I had ignored for far too long. I moved through the house with a cold, detached efficiency. Every expensive vase, every designer throw pillow, every piece of modern art hanging on the walls was a testament to my financial bleeding. I walked past the guest bedrooms they had insisted they needed for entertaining rooms that remained perpetually empty while I slept on a lumpy mattress in the backyard. The sheer audacity of their lifestyle, funded entirely by my sweat, and my late wife's frugal savings, filled me with a quiet, terrifying resolve. I was not a victim seeking an apology. I was a man preparing to execute a complete demolition of their comfortable world. I finally reached the heavy oak door of Tyler's home office at the end of the hallway. Tyler always treated this room as his private, untouchable sanctuary, a place where he supposedly managed his complex investments and handled the household finances. He strictly forbade anyone from entering, claiming his paperwork was highly sensitive. I took a long, deep breath, firmly braced myself for the absolute worst, and pushed the heavy door open, stepping into the quiet room. The office was in complete disarray, a sharp and telling contrast to the pristine, catalog-ready condition of the rest of the house. It was glaringly obvious they had been in a frantic, desperate rush to pack for their fraudulent European getaway. Desk drawers were left half open, exposing tangled cords and scattered pens. A coffee mug stained with a dark brown ring sat abandoned next to a haphazard stack of disorganized mail. A half-packed briefcase was slouched on the leather sofa. But 2 specific things instantly caught my trained, observant eye as I scanned the chaotic room. First, the heavy-duty commercial paper shredder sitting in the corner of the room was completely full. The clear plastic bin was visibly bursting with freshly shredded documents, paper curled into thousands of unreadable ribbons. They had been destroying a massive amount of evidence right before they left for the airport. Second, sitting directly in the center of Tyler's massive mahogany desk, surrounded by scattered post-it notes and empty file folders, was a heavy fireproof metal lockbox. In their desperate hurry to leave for the airport, navigate the heavy morning traffic, and successfully execute their grand deception at the terminal, Tyler had made a critical, fatal error. The brass latch was not fully secured. The heavy metal lid of the lockbox was left slightly ajar. I slowly approached the desk, feeling my pulse steady into a calm, highly focused rhythm as I reached out to fully open the cold metal lid, prepare my tired mind, and finally uncover the absolute ultimate betrayal they had deeply buried inside this very room for me today. The heavy metal lid yielded with a sharp metallic groan as I pulled it completely back on its stiff hinges. Inside the dim cavity of the lockbox, the air smelled faintly of stale paper and cold steel. My calloused hands hovered over the opening for a brief moment. Given the $15,000 in fraudulent credit card charges I had just discovered during the ride over, I had mentally braced myself for the typical spoils of a sloppy, desperate theft. I honestly expected to find hidden bundles of stolen cash, secretly diverted bank statements, or perhaps glossy travel itineraries detailing their luxurious Mediterranean escape. I was prepared for greed. I was prepared for a cowardly misappropriation of my personal funds. But what actually lay inside that heavy steel box was far more insidious and far more dangerous than a few stolen vacations. There was no cash. There were no colorful brochures. There was only a single remarkably thick manila folder resting squarely at the bottom of the container. I reached in and pulled it out. The folder was heavy packed tight with dozens of pages of densely printed legal and financial documents. Written across the front tab in Tyler's familiar precise handwriting were two simple words: Estate Financials. My brow furrowed in deep confusion as I stared at the black ink. I was the sole owner of this property. I had purchased this sprawling estate in its entirety with a massive singular wire transfer of $1.8 million. There was no mortgage. There were no lingering debts or complex financial structures tied to the property. The house was owned free and clear, protected within the ironclad confines of a revocable living trust that I and only I controlled. Therefore, there was absolutely no logical reason for my son to maintain a hidden locked file labeled Estate Financials, unless he was managing something I knew absolutely nothing about. I walked over to the large mahogany desk, my heavy work boots making no sound on the thick woven rug. I set the heavy manila folder down on the polished wood surface and flipped the thick cover open. The very first page bore the bold, unmistakable logo of a major national bank. It was the same bank where I had held my business and personal accounts for the past 4 decades. But this document was not a simple bank statement or a routine balance inquiry. It was a formal, highly detailed application for a home equity line of credit, commonly known in my line of work as a HELOC. My eyes scanned the dense columns of text, rapidly absorbing the complex financial data. The application listed the property address of the estate, the exact square footage, the recent tax appraisals, and a comprehensive breakdown of the home's current market value. But my eyes completely froze when I reached the requested loan amount section. The number was printed in bold, undeniable black ink. $600,000. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face, leaving a cold, prickling sensation creeping across my scalp. $600,000. They were attempting to borrow over $500,000 against the raw equity of the home I had purchased with my life savings. As a former general contractor who has built and financed hundreds of homes throughout my career, I understand exactly how a home equity line of credit functions. It is essentially a massive second mortgage. It allows a homeowner to borrow vast sums of cash using the physical property as collateral. If the borrower defaults on the loan, if they take the cash and run the bank, has the absolute legal right to foreclose on the property. The bank can seize the home, sell it at auction, and completely wipe out the original owner to recoup their losses. Tyler and Megan were not just stealing money from my credit cards. They were actively attempting to mortgage my entire estate out from under me. They were trying to extract $600,000 in pure, untraceable cash, leaving my home saddled with a massive toxic debt that I would ultimately be forced to pay off or risk losing my home entirely to the bank. The sheer breathtaking scale of the deception forced me to pull out the heavy leather desk chair and sit down. My knees suddenly felt weak, unsteady, unable to support the weight of this terrifying revelation. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady my racing pulse. How could they possibly accomplish this? I asked myself in the silent, empty room. The property was shielded by the Revocable Living Trust. I was the sole trustee. My son was merely a listed beneficiary upon my death. He held absolutely no legal authority to borrow against the asset. He had no power of attorney. He had no legal standing whatsoever to encumber the estate with a massive bank loan. The bank underwriters would instantly reject the application unless the primary property owner explicitly authorized the transaction. I began to frantically flip through the thick stack of papers, bypassing the endless pages of terms, conditions, and standard bank disclosures. I was looking for the final authorization pages. I needed to see exactly how they planned to bypass the strict legal protections of my trust. I reached the back of the heavy packet. The final 3 pages were the binding legal agreements, the official signatures required to finalize the $600,000 lien against the property. I stared down at the bottom of the very last page. There, resting perfectly on the solid black signature line, was my name. Harrison Cole. I leaned in closer, my chest tightening so severely I could barely draw a breath. It was signed in dark blue ink. It was not a sloppy, hurried attempt. It was a flawless, meticulous replica of my personal signature. The distinct loop of the capital H, the sharp, aggressive angle of the letter C, the slight downward slant at the very end of my last name. It was all there, replicated with terrifying accuracy. Someone had clearly spent hours, perhaps days, practicing the exact fluid motion of my handwriting, tracing it over and over until they could reproduce it perfectly on demand. This was no longer just a case of an ungrateful son acting out, or a greedy daughter-in-law pushing boundaries. This was not a simple family dispute over travel expenses or credit card bills. This was a severe, premeditated federal crime. They had deliberately committed felony fraud. They had forged my signature on official bank documents to steal $600,000 in equity from my estate. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, the forged document still resting in my calloused hands. The room around me felt completely still, entirely disconnected from the reality I had woken up to just a few short hours ago. I realized then the true horrifying brilliance of their fake Mediterranean cruise. They needed me gone. They needed me completely isolated on a ship in the middle of the ocean, without reliable cellular service or access to my mail. The HELOC approval process takes roughly 14 days to close and disperse the physical funds. They had shipped me away for a 14-day cruise to ensure I would not be home to intercept the bank's verification letters, answer the underwriter's phone calls, or accidentally discover the massive lien being placed against my property. The cruise was never a birthday present. It was an elaborate, expensive distraction, designed specifically to keep the victim out of the house while the criminals robbed him blind. And when I returned from my wonderful, relaxing vacation, they would already have the $600,000 safely hidden away in a separate account, leaving me to eventually discover that I owed a massive debt to the bank. I carefully set the forged document back down on the mahogany desk. I did not feel panic. I did not feel the crushing, paralyzing weight of a broken heart. The man who had loved his son, the man who had bought this beautiful estate to keep his family together, had completely died the moment I saw that forged blue ink. In his place was a contractor staring at a structure that was completely infested with rot. And I knew exactly what I had to do next. This was why they needed me out of the country. I sat there, in the heavy leather chair, the stifling silence of the massive main house pressing in on me from every possible direction. I laid the home equity line of credit application completely flat against the polished surface of the mahogany desk, carefully smoothing out a slight crease at the bottom corner with the edge of my thumb. For 40 uninterrupted years, my entire livelihood depended entirely on my unique ability to read complex architectural blueprints. I spent decades staring at massive, intimidating sheets of blue and white paper, training my tired eyes to instantly spot a millimeter of deviation in a load-bearing column or a tiny miscalculation in the pitch of a steep roof. When you build custom homes for a living, you learn very quickly that the smallest, almost invisible details are usually the exact ones that bring the entire structure crashing down around you. So I applied that exact same rigorous, unforgiving scrutiny to the black ink resting on the final page of the banking document. I stared intensely at the signature. Harrison Cole. At first glance, to a lazy bank underwriter shuffling blindly through hundreds of routine pages a day, it probably looked incredibly accurate. It had the bold, sweeping loops and the aggressive upward slants that I had consistently used to sign thousands of municipal contractor permits and heavy material invoices. But as I leaned much closer, resting my heavy elbows on the cold desk, the structural flaws, the brazen forgery, began to reveal themselves in glaring, undeniable detail. The physical pressure of the pen against the paper was completely wrong. When I write my name, my 70-year-old hands press deeply and forcefully into the page, a physical habit permanently formed by decades of writing on thick carbon copy clipboards out in the freezing Boston winter weather. My authentic signature always leaves a distinct tactile groove in the paper that you can feel with your fingertips. This signature, however, rested lightly and perfectly on the surface. It was far too smooth. It was a flawless, sterile tracing. Furthermore, it completely lacked the subtle, involuntary tremor that occasionally catches the very end of the letter E, an unavoidable byproduct of the severe arthritis that has relentlessly plagued my joints for the last decade. Someone had practiced this specific signature meticulously for days, prioritizing pure aesthetic perfection over genuine, flawed human execution. My gaze slowly shifted down the crisp white page, moving just below the fabricated evidence of my legal consent. My eyes immediately locked onto the bright blue, perfectly circular stamp of a registered public notary. In the state of Massachusetts, you cannot possibly finalize a massive real estate loan without an authorized state official physically verifying the identity of the person signing the financial document. The bank naturally demands absolute legal certainty when dispensing hundreds of thousands of dollars in raw cash. I leaned in and read the tiny curved text bearing the notary's full name and their official commission expiration date. A bitter, entirely humorless smile slowly crept across my weathered face. I recognized the name instantly, without a shadow of a doubt. It was a woman named Sarah, a former real estate associate, who used to work directly in the exact same boutique brokerage office as my daughter-in-law Megan. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of this discovery washed over me in cold waves. This was not a panicked, desperate mistake made in the heat of a sudden financial crisis. Tyler and Megan had not just scribbled my name on a desk in a fleeting moment of weak judgment. They had actively, intentionally recruited a corrupt state official to quietly participate in a severe federal crime. They had brought in a willing third party, someone entirely loyal to Megan, to legally certify a ghost. Sarah had pressed her official state-sanctioned seal onto this document, falsely declaring to the government and the lending bank that Harrison Cole had sat physically in her presence, presented a valid government photo identification, and willingly signed away the massive equity of his $1.8 million private estate. The rot did not just reside within the walls of my own family. It extended outward into the community, orchestrated by a woman who clearly believed she was entirely above the law and facilitated by a cowardly son who was simply too weak to stop her madness. I leaned back deeply into the heavy leather chair, intertwining my calloused fingers and resting them squarely on my chest. I looked away from the damning paper and stared blankly at the far wall of the quiet office, letting the scattered, confusing pieces of their grand deception slowly assemble into a coherent, horrifying timeline. My active mind drifted back to the noisy airport terminal, to the dry text message, and to the meticulously planned 14-day Mediterranean luxury cruise I had generously purchased for my 70th birthday. Suddenly, the absolute, undeniable brilliance of their geographical decoy clicked perfectly into place with terrifying clarity. I understand the stringent, complex regulations of commercial banking just as well as I understand residential zoning laws. When a property owner applies for a massive home equity line of credit, federal law mandates a strict 3-day right of rescission period. After that mandatory cooling-off period completely expires, the bank's underwriting department requires a very specific window of time to process the final title. Checks wire the massive sum of cash and mail out the physical confirmation documents to the primary residence. The entire process, from the final forged signature to the stolen money landing safely in a checking account, takes approximately 2 weeks, exactly 14 days. They did not just want a free luxury European vacation for Richard and Patricia. The expensive cruise was a highly calculated tactical dead zone. They specifically needed me trapped on a massive steel ship floating helplessly somewhere between the coast of Italy and the Greek islands. They needed me geographically isolated, entirely surrounded by open ocean, without a reliable cellular signal or secure, consistent internet access. If I was completely out of the country, I could not walk out to the mailbox and check my domestic mail. I could not intercept the final approval letters from the bank. If the fraud department called to verbally verify the massive sudden withdrawal against my property, my mobile phone would go straight to a generic, unhelpful voicemail. They had carefully, deliberately packed me away into a floating containment unit, ensuring I remained completely blind and deaf to the world, while they effortlessly drained $600,000 in raw equity from my personal estate. The profound, sickening depth of their betrayal settled deeply into my aging bones, leaving behind a cold, sharp, unyielding determination. I had the physical document, the irrefutable, undeniable proof of the forged signature and the fraudulent notary stamp. But I knew that taking a single piece of paper to my aggressive estate attorney, Victor Lawson, would not be nearly enough to execute the swift, merciless retaliation I was currently designing in my head. I needed to fundamentally prove their malicious intent. I needed the undeniable documented conversations where they explicitly, arrogantly mapped out this financial execution. I needed the permanent digital footprints of their criminal conspiracy. I turned my attention to the sleek, expansive silver iMac computer sitting squarely in the center of Tyler's mahogany desk. The large monitor was currently completely black, fast asleep in the quiet, empty room. When we all first moved into this massive estate, Tyler had endlessly complained about his frustrating lack of technical skills, so I had personally spent an entire Saturday afternoon patiently setting up this very computer for him. I knew every single lazy digital habit my son possessed. I knew that he absolutely despised typing out long, detailed text messages on his small phone screen while he was supposedly working in his home office. To completely avoid the minor inconvenience, he had linked his Apple iCloud account directly to this desktop machine. Every single message he ever sent or received on his cellular device was automatically, instantly mirrored onto this hard drive. I reached out and placed my rough hand over the smooth, white plastic mouse. I gave it a slight, deliberate nudge. The large computer screen instantly flared to life, illuminating the dark, shadowy office with a bright, crisp, glowing blue light. The standard login screen appeared immediately, patiently waiting for a user password. Tyler had never been particularly creative or cautious with his personal digital security. I knew his administrative passcode was simply Megan's birth month and day, followed by their wedding anniversary year. I took one final, steadying breath to calm my racing heart. I slowly raised my hands and carefully rested my fingers on the quiet keyboard. I was about to dive deep into the digital shadows of my son's private conversations, fully prepared to uncover the ultimate ruthless truth of exactly what they planned to do with me once the stolen money was safely and permanently in their hands. But my fingers never actually pressed down on the keys. A sudden sharp wave of practical caution halted my movement entirely. I am a man who has spent 40 years navigating the treacherous, highly litigious waters of commercial real estate and large-scale construction. I know firsthand that when you discover a massive structural failure, your very first action is never to start blindly ripping out the drywall yourself. Your first action is to immediately call the structural engineer to legally assess the true extent of the hidden damage. I realized that reading my son's private messages would only give me the emotional context of his betrayal. What I desperately needed right now was absolute legal protection against the $600,000 financial bomb he had just planted beneath my feet. I slowly pulled my hands away from the sleek keyboard. I reached into my heavy jacket pocket and pulled my smartphone back out. I opened my contacts and scrolled down until I found the name Victor Lawson. Victor was not a warm, friendly family attorney who handled simple wills and basic traffic tickets. Victor was a high-priced, impeccably dressed legal shark operating out of a sleek corner office in downtown Boston. He was the brilliant, ruthless estate lawyer who had meticulously drafted the ironclad revocable living trust that currently held all of my physical assets. I had hired him exactly for this reason. He possessed a cold, calculating, and entirely unforgiving legal mind. When I pressed the green call button, I did not want a sympathetic ear. I wanted a mercenary. The phone rang twice before Victor answered. His voice was sharp, professional, and completely devoid of unnecessary pleasantries. He immediately recognized my number. He asked me what was wrong, noting that I was supposed to be boarding a luxury cruise ship bound for the Mediterranean at this exact hour. I did not waste a single second with small talk. I spoke in a low, measured tone, laying out the raw facts exactly as if I were reading a damage report on a condemned building. I told him about the sudden text message at the airport terminal. I told him about the $15,000 in fraudulent luxury travel charges I had just found on my emergency platinum card. Finally, and most importantly, I told him about the heavy metal lockbox sitting open on Tyler's desk and the thick manila folder resting inside it. I explained the home equity line of credit application in meticulous detail. I read him the loan amount of $600,000. I described the flawless forgery of my personal signature sitting at the bottom of the final page, and I named the specific private notary, the former associate of my daughter-in-law, whose official blue stamp falsely certified the entire fraudulent document. Victor remained absolutely silent on the other end of the line for a long, heavy moment. In the legal profession, silence from a man like Victor Lawson is never a sign of confusion. It is the sound of a predator silently calculating the exact trajectory of its attack. When Victor finally spoke, his voice carried a chilling, razor-sharp edge. He told me that I had just narrowly avoided complete financial ruin by a margin of mere hours. He expertly broke down the precise mechanics of their devastating plan. He explained that a home equity line of credit of that massive size requires a mandatory federal cooling-off period, followed by a strict, highly regulated underwriting and disbursement phase. The entire process takes exactly 14 days to completely clear the bank's internal security protocols. "They needed you on that ship," Harrison Victor said, his words dropping like heavy stones. "They specifically engineered this fake vacation to keep you physically isolated in international waters. If you were floating somewhere off the coast of Italy, you would have zero access to your domestic postal mail. You would never see the final approval letters arriving at the estate. Your mobile phone would be completely out of the country, meaning the bank's fraud prevention department would roll straight to your voicemail if they attempted to verbally verify the massive withdrawal." Victor continued painting a horrifying picture of what would have happened if I had actually boarded that flight. Once the 14-day processing window closed, the bank would deposit the $600,000 in raw equity directly into an account controlled by Tyler and Megan. Because they had forged the documents to look completely legitimate, the bank would assume I had authorized the transfer. The very second that cash hit their account, Tyler would have immediately wired it offshore or funneled it directly into an irrevocable trust controlled entirely by Megan's parents. The money would have instantly vanished into a complex, untraceable web of legal loopholes. By the time you returned from your 14-day cruise, Victor explained coldly, the cash would be completely gone and you would be left holding the bag. The bank would hold a $600,000 legally binding lien against your $1.8 million property. You would be entirely responsible for repaying a massive debt you never actually authorized. If you refused, or if you simply could not afford the crushing monthly payments on a fixed retirement income, the bank would legally foreclose on the estate. They would seize the property, evict you from your own guest house, and auction the home to the highest bidder to recoup their stolen funds. Your own son was fully prepared to let you lose everything you have ever worked for. I listened to the terrifying reality of his words, feeling a dark, heavy knot tighten in the center of my chest. I had spent 40 years building a safe, secure life, and my own flesh and blood had systematically rigged it with financial explosives. But then Victor's tone shifted from grave warning to aggressive, calculated authority. He reminded me of the foundational legal structure we had built together when I first purchased the estate. He reminded me of the absolute, unyielding power of the revocable living trust. "Harrison, you need to remember exactly who holds the power here," Victor said, his voice rising with intense, controlled energy. "You did not just buy them a house. You purchased an asset and placed it entirely within a protective trust where you are the sole, undisputed trustee. Tyler and Megan are not co-owners. They have absolutely no equity, no legal standing, and no permanent rights to the property. In the eyes of the law, they are nothing more than simple tenants at will. They exist on your property solely by your continuous grace." He paused, letting the immense weight of that legal reality wash over me. "The trust gives you absolute God-like power over that estate, Harrison. You can sell it, you can lease it, or you can order a commercial demolition crew to tear it down to the bare dirt. They have handed us the perfect weapon by committing felony fraud against the trust itself. They have completely voided any tenant rights they might have claimed. I will secure their written confessions right now, I promised." I ended the call with Victor and placed my cellular phone face down onto the smooth surface of the mahogany desk. The quiet click of the plastic casing against the polished wood echoed loudly in the cavernous, empty room. I sat in the heavy leather executive chair for a long moment, allowing the absolute gravity of the situation to settle into my aging bones. I was a father who had spent 70 years trying to build a legacy of warmth, security, and trust. Now I was a man actively gathering digital evidence to legally execute my own flesh and blood. It is a sickening transition to make in the span of a single Tuesday morning. But the structural integrity of my family was completely compromised. The rot had spread too deeply. I had to rip out the infected framework before the entire roof caved in and crushed me. I turned my undivided attention back to the large silver computer monitor glowing brightly in the center of the desk. The login screen was still waiting patiently for a password. I reached out, my thick fingers hovering over the sleek, low-profile keyboard. I knew the specific sequence by heart. It was Megan's birth month, birthday, and the 4-digit year of their wedding anniversary. I pressed the soft keys in rapid succession and struck the enter button. The screen instantly unlocked, sweeping away the generic landscape wallpaper and revealing a highly cluttered, disorganized desktop interface. Tyler always claimed to be overwhelmed by his administrative duties, but looking at the chaotic mess of random digital files, unpaid invoices, and unsorted digital folders scattered across his screen, I realized he was simply lazy. I ignored the clutter. I was not here to clean up his digital mess. I moved the mouse, directing the cursor down to the bottom edge of the screen, where a row of application icons sat waiting. I found the green speech bubble icon, the application that synced his cellular text messages directly to his computer. I clicked it twice. The application window immediately expanded, filling the center of the bright monitor. On the left side of the screen, a long, continuous column of recent conversations populated instantly. I saw text threads with various local contractors' messages from the private country club they desperately tried to impress, and numerous automated alerts from high-end retail stores. But I was looking for a very specific chain of communication. I scrolled down the list until I spotted a group chat containing 3 participants. It was labeled simply as family. The 3 profile pictures attached to the thread belonged to Tyler, Megan, and Patricia, my daughter-in-law's demanding mother. I clicked on the specific group chat. The right side of the screen immediately populated with an incredibly long, unbroken stream of blue and gray text bubbles. This was the unfiltered private channel where they coordinated their daily lives, aired their grievances, and apparently plotted the total financial demolition of my estate. I moved my hand to the scroll wheel. I knew whatever plan they had executed today had not been formed overnight. A massive fraud operation requiring a corrupt public notary, an international cruise decoy, and a flawless signature forgery took considerable time to properly construct. I began scrolling backward through time. I watched weeks and then months of their daily mundane conversations fly past my tired eyes. I bypassed endless complaints about the landscaping crew I hired for them, petty arguments over which restaurant to visit, and the constant nagging demands from Patricia about needing more financial support for her luxurious lifestyle. I stopped scrolling when I reached a distinct block of messages dated nearly 4 months ago. It was late November, right around the time Tyler had originally suggested the idea of a Mediterranean birthday cruise for me. I leaned closely toward the glowing screen, carefully reading the specific exchange. Patricia had initiated the conversation late on a Sunday evening. She was complaining bitterly about a wealthy couple in her social circle who had recently purchased a luxurious winter retirement property in South Florida. Patricia typed long paragraphs detailing how humiliating it was to be the only person in her country club without a seasonal beachfront condominium in Boca Raton. She told her daughter she was drowning in social embarrassment and demanded to know when Tyler was finally going to secure the lucrative corporate promotion he had been promising them. Megan's response was immediate and fiercely protective of her mother's fragile, artificial social status. She told Patricia to stop worrying and completely dismiss her wealthy friends. Megan typed out a long, detailed paragraph that made my chest constrict with cold, absolute clarity. She assured her mother that she had already found the perfect newly renovated beachfront condominium in Boca Raton. The exact asking price for the coastal property was $600,000. Patricia responded with a frantic string of question marks, demanding to know how they could possibly afford such an astronomical purchase when they were already struggling to maintain the massive Boston estate. I stared unblinking at the bright screen as I read Megan's next specific response. It was typed with the chilling casual confidence of a seasoned predator circling a wounded animal. Megan told her mother to relax and let her handle the complex financial logistics. She explicitly stated, "We are not going to use our own savings to buy the Florida condo. We are going to secure the $600,000 by quietly leveraging the old man's property. He is completely clueless about modern banking. He just sits in his depressing guest house playing with his tools and reminiscing about Diana. Tyler and I are going to extract the maximum equity from the estate, transfer the funds into an untraceable private trust under your name, and close on the Boca Raton condo in cash." Tyler had chimed into the group chat exactly 3 minutes later. My own son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love and dedication I possessed, responded with a short, confirming sentence. He typed, "Do not worry. Patricia, we have the entire banking process completely figured out. We just need to get him out of the state for a couple of weeks, so the loan officers do not accidentally alert him during the mandatory cooling-off period." I sat in the leather chair, breathing slowly and rhythmically through my nose. There it was, the absolute, undeniable written confession. The motive and the specific execution timeline were all neatly laid out in black and white digital text. But I needed to know what they planned to do next. I moved my hand back to the smooth plastic mouse. I navigated directly to the messages they had sent just 3 days ago. I clicked into the search bar at the top right corner. I carefully typed my own name, Harrison. I pressed the return key. The application instantly filtered out the irrelevant messages, isolating only the conversations where my name was explicitly mentioned. The screen refreshed. I leaned into the bright monitor, searching for their ultimate exit strategy. What I found in those final paragraphs made my blood run completely cold. My eyes remained fixed on the glowing blue interface of the computer screen. The search function had already begun to filter through the massive digital archive of their private conversations. I had typed my own name into the search bar, but I quickly realized that they rarely ever referred to me by my actual given name in their daily chats. I deleted the text and typed a new phrase, the old man. The application paused for a fraction of a second before a new, incredibly dense column of text bubbles flooded the right side of the monitor. The timestamps indicated that this specific exchange had taken place exactly 3 days ago, late on a Friday evening, just hours before they finalized their packing for the fraudulent cruise. I moved the silver mouse and clicked on the very first highlighted message. The room around me felt completely devoid of oxygen as I began to read the casual, rapid-fire exchange between my son and my daughter-in-law. It was a sterile, business-like conversation about the final logistical steps of their criminal conspiracy, completely devoid of any human empathy or familial loyalty. Megan had initiated this particular segment of the chat. Her digital avatar, a smiling photograph taken at a luxurious country club gala that I had personally paid for, sat directly next to a long, detailed paragraph. I leaned closer to the monitor, my face bathed in the cold, artificial light, and read her exact words. Megan had written, "Once the HELOC completely clears and the funds are dispersed, the Florida condo will officially be in my parents' names, totally untouchable." But what exactly are we doing about Harrison? He is going to notice the sudden influx of bank letters eventually. We cannot keep intercepting his mail forever once he gets back from the ship. I stared at those specific sentences, letting the sheer, unadulterated callousness of her concern wash over me. She was not worried about the moral implications of stealing $600,000. She was not concerned about the devastating financial impact this massive lien would have on my quiet retirement. She was solely focused on the practical inconvenience of my inevitable discovery. I was a loose end. I was a simple, annoying logistical hurdle that needed to be permanently managed before I could disrupt their perfect, stolen real estate transaction. I took a slow, deliberate breath, my chest rising and falling in the silent office. I moved my eyes down to the next gray text bubble. It was Tyler's response, time-stamped less than 2 minutes later. This was the moment of absolute truth. This was the exact response from the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had patiently taught to ride a bicycle, the man for whom I had sacrificed my entire life savings. I read my son's words. Tyler had typed, "Do not worry about him. We will simply claim that he has severe rapid onset dementia. He is already 70 years old, so the courts will easily believe it. We will use a small portion of the loan money to immediately put him in that state-run assisted living facility upstate. Once he is safely locked away in a memory care ward, I will file the emergency medical paperwork to take over the trust as his sole legal power of attorney." I sat perfectly still. The heavy mahogany desk beneath my hands felt like blocks of solid ice. A state-run assisted living facility. They were not merely planning to steal my equity. They were actively, methodically planning to strip away my fundamental human freedom. They intended to legally declare me mentally incompetent, lock me inside a sterile, depressing government asylum, and completely hijack the legal control of my revocable living trust. Tyler was fully prepared to falsely testify to my mental decline, leveraging my advanced age as a convenient weapon to secure his own financial independence. He was perfectly willing to condemn his own father to a locked, heavily medicated ward just so he could buy his greedy in-laws a luxurious beachfront house in Florida. The profound depravity of the plan was staggering. I forced my tired eyes to move down to the very final message in the thread. It was Megan's concluding thought on the matter. She responded with absolute chilling enthusiasm. "Good," she wrote. "I am completely sick of looking at his ugly, depressing guest house anyway. Once we secure the medical power of attorney and get him moved upstate, we will just bulldoze the entire structure and use the extra space to put in a custom infinity pool." The cursor blinked steadily at the end of her sentence, a rhythmic, mocking pulse in the silent room. There were absolutely no tears welling in my eyes. There was no sudden, overwhelming urge to break down and weep for the lost relationship with my only child. Any remaining fragments of paternal affection, any lingering, desperate hopes that my son was simply a misguided victim of his wife's manipulation, were instantly and permanently incinerated. In their place, a terrifying, absolute calm descended over my entire body. It was the icy, calculated serenity of a man who suddenly realizes that the person he loved no longer exists. My son was entirely dead to me. The man who typed those messages was nothing more than a dangerous, hostile parasite occupying my property. I reached into the pocket of my heavy work jacket and pulled out my cellular phone. I opened the high-resolution camera application and held the device steady over the glowing computer screen. I carefully snapped several clear, perfectly focused photographs of the entire conversation. I captured every single horrific word, ensuring that the specific digital timestamps and the verified phone numbers were completely visible in the frame. This was the undeniable proof of their malicious intent. This was the absolute ironclad documentation that Victor Lawson required to permanently dismantle their lives. I lowered the phone, verifying that the captured images were securely saved to my digital gallery. I then reached forward and gently nudged the plastic mouse, moving the cursor to the top corner of the screen and closing the messaging application, leaving the desktop exactly as I had found it. I closed the heavy metal lid of the fireproof lockbox, carefully leaving the brass latch slightly ajar, precisely mimicking their fatal, hurried mistake. I turned away from the desk and walked slowly back out into the grand hallway of the sprawling, immaculate estate. The suffocating silence of the massive house no longer felt oppressive. It simply felt like a vacant building waiting to be demolished. I raised my smartphone to my ear and pressed the green call button. Victor answered the incoming call almost immediately. I did not waste any of my time with polite or useless introductions. My voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of any hesitation. "Victor, I have the written proof," I said clearly. "I have the entire timeline and their explicit motive documented in photographs. Burn it all down. Freeze the bank application today and prepare the eviction notices. I want to sell the estate by the end of this week." I ended the call with Victor and spent the remainder of the weekend in a state of absolute, unbreakable focus. I did not sleep. I did not mourn. I simply packed the rest of my essential belongings from the guest house into the back of my heavy work truck and waited for the dawn of the new business week. When the sun finally crested over the Boston skyline on Monday morning, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns of the estate, I was preparing to liquidate. I was already behind the wheel. I drove away from the property without looking back in the rearview mirror. My destination was the primary downtown branch of my long-standing financial institution. I have done business with this specific bank for nearly 4 decades. They held the original operating accounts for my contracting business, financed my early construction equipment, and eventually managed the massive liquid capital I acquired after successfully selling my entire commercial enterprise. As I walked through the heavy glass double doors, the familiar scent of polished granite and quiet, sterile air conditioning greeted me. I bypassed the standard teller lines entirely and walked directly toward the glass-walled offices lining the far side of the lobby. I was not here to make a simple withdrawal. I was here to detonate a financial explosive. I knocked once on the heavy glass door belonging to David Sterling, the senior branch manager, and let myself in. David was a sharp, meticulous man in his late 50s. He had personally overseen my portfolio for the last 15 years. He looked up from his computer monitor, his face instantly breaking into a warm, professional smile. He stood up, extending a hand across his pristine desk, likely expecting a routine conversation about municipal bonds or conservative mutual fund yields. I did not shake his hand. I sat down heavily in the leather guest chair and placed the thick manila folder directly onto the center of his desk. The warm smile faded from David's face, replaced by a look of cautious concern as he noted my grim, unyielding expression. I told him to open the folder. I told him to look very closely at the final page of the home equity line of credit application. David opened the heavy cover and quickly scanned the dense financial data. His eyes moved rapidly across the pages, absorbing the property details and the staggering $600,000 loan request. When he finally reached the signature page, I watched his brow furrow in deep professional confusion. He looked up at me, adjusting his glasses. He noted that the application appeared to be in perfect order, but he was confused as to why I was bringing a physical copy into his office when the funds were scheduled to disperse by the end of the week. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the edge of his desk. I looked him dead in the eye and told him in a voice that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation that I had never seen this document before in my entire life. I told him the signature resting on that solid black line was a complete calculated forgery. The color completely drained from David's face. In the highly regulated world of commercial banking, the word forgery is a catastrophic alarm bell. I did not give him a chance to speak. I pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at the bright blue stamp resting just below the forged ink. I explained exactly who that notary was. I told him that Sarah was a former real estate associate of my daughter-in-law, Megan. I laid out the entire sickening timeline. I explained how my son and his wife had deliberately engineered a fake 14-day Mediterranean luxury cruise for my 70th birthday. They had specifically designed the trip to keep me geographically isolated, floating in international waters without cellular service, while this exact 14-day underwriting process quietly cleared the bank's internal security protocols. I told him they had used a corrupt, legally registered state official to falsely certify my presence and authenticate a ghost. David fell back into his chair, visibly shaken by the sheer audacity and scale of the attempted theft. He immediately reached for his desk phone, his hands trembling slightly, as he dialed the internal, highly restricted extension for the bank's National Fraud Division. While he waited for the senior investigators to answer the line, I issued my next set of absolute directives. I was not going to leave a single penny accessible to the people who had tried to bury me. I instructed David to immediately freeze the home equity line of credit application. I demanded that every single active checking and savings account linked to my name be instantly locked, drained, and permanently closed. I wanted the liquid funds transferred directly into a newly established, highly secure account, protected by a complex, multi-factor authentication protocol that only I could physically access. Then I addressed the final, most satisfying piece of the financial demolition. I pulled my sleek leather wallet from my pocket and withdrew the heavy metal emergency platinum credit card. This was the exact account my son had linked to his digital wallet. This was the account currently funding their fraudulent, lavish European getaway. I placed the metal card onto the desk with a sharp, satisfying click. I told David to terminate the line of credit immediately. I did not want a temporary freeze. I wanted the account permanently canceled, completely scorched from the bank's mainframe. I sat back in my chair, allowing a cold, deeply satisfying image to form in my mind. I pictured Tyler and Megan standing arrogantly in the grand, opulent lobby of their exclusive $1,500 a night Tuscan resort. I imagined Megan holding her designer luggage, wearing an expensive silk outfit purchased with my hard-earned money, waiting impatiently for the staff to cater to her every demanding whim. I imagined the absolute unadulterated panic washing over their arrogant faces when they confidently attempted to settle their exorbitant luxury bill, only to be handed a declined, useless piece of digital plastic by a highly unamused, thoroughly professional Italian hotel concierge. They had stolen my trust. They had attempted to steal my home and my freedom. Now they were about to discover exactly what it felt like to be stranded in a foreign country, thousands of miles from home, without a single financial safety net to catch them. They were completely on their own, completely exposed to the harsh reality they had built. David hung up the phone after speaking extensively with the senior fraud investigators. He looked across the desk, his expression grave and entirely resolute. He assured me that the massive loan application was officially terminated and completely voided from the system. Furthermore, he confirmed that the bank's specialized legal department was immediately opening a severe comprehensive federal investigation into Tyler Megan and the corrupt notary who had illegally facilitated the crime. I thanked David for his decades of service and quietly walked out. I drove my heavy truck directly toward Victor's law office to execute the physical eviction notices. The drive from the bank to downtown Boston was a blur of gray asphalt and heavy morning traffic. I steered my battered work truck through the narrow, crowded streets with mechanical precision, my mind entirely focused on the legal execution I was about to set into motion. I pulled into the underground parking garage of the sleek glass tower that housed Victor Lawson's prestigious firm. The air down here was cool and smelled faintly of expensive engine oil and damp concrete. I took the express elevator straight to the 42nd floor, stepping into a reception area wrapped in dark walnut paneling. Victor's legal assistant, a sharp young woman who never smiled unnecessarily, recognized me instantly and ushered me past the heavy double doors into his private corner office. Victor was already standing behind his massive desk, his hands planted firmly on the polished wood, waiting for my arrival. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my cellular phone, and laid it down in front of him. I opened the digital photo gallery and swiped to the high-resolution images I had captured from Tyler's computer monitor just a few hours prior. I stood in absolute silence as Victor picked up the device and began to read the captured text messages. I watched his cold, calculating eyes track back and forth across the screen, absorbing every single line of the digital confession. He read Megan's arrogant promise to leverage my property to buy her mother a Florida condominium. He read Tyler's cowardly agreement to lock me in a state-run asylum and seize my medical power of attorney. He read their enthusiastic plans to bulldoze my modest guest house to build a custom infinity pool. Victor did not gasp or ever express any dramatic shock. He simply placed the phone back onto the desk and exhaled a long, steady breath. In all my years of practicing aggressive estate law, Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, I have seen families tear each other apart over money. I have seen bitter siblings lie, cheat, and steal for a larger slice of a shrinking pie. But the sheer, predatory malice contained in these messages is entirely unique. They did not just want to rob you, Harrison. They wanted to permanently erase your legal existence and imprison you in a medical facility to cover their tracks. I pulled out a leather chair and sat down, resting my heavy hands on my knees. I asked Victor how quickly we could legally remove them from the premises. I wanted them out of the house before their fraudulent Mediterranean cruise ship ever returned to port. Victor slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket and took a seat across from me. He steepled his fingers, tapping his thumbs together in a rhythmic, methodical motion. Under standard landlord and tenant regulations in this state, an eviction is a sluggish, bureaucratic process, he explained. Even with clear, documented cause, we would be legally required to issue a formal 30-day notice to quit. If they decided to aggressively contest the eviction upon their return, citing established residency and fighting us in civil court, the legal proceedings could easily drag out for 60 to 90 days. They could potentially force their way back into the house while the courts slowly sorted out the paperwork. I felt a sharp, heavy surge of anger tighten my chest. I absolutely refused to let them spend another night sleeping under a roof that I had purchased with my life savings. I told Victor that 60 days was completely unacceptable. I needed them permanently locked out today. A sharp predator's smile crept across Victor's face. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. That is exactly why we are not going to use standard tenant eviction laws, Harrison. We are going to rely entirely on the foundational structure of the revocable living trust. When I originally drafted that comprehensive legal binder for you, I specifically included a protective measure known in our circles as a hostile act clause. It is an ironclad provision designed to instantly sever all legal ties and occupancy rights of any listed beneficiary if they commit a documented felony against the trust or the primary trustee. Because Tyler and Megan have committed premeditated federal bank fraud, specifically attempting to encumber the physical property held within the trust, they have triggered this exact clause. They are no longer considered legal tenants. They are now classified as hostile, unauthorized trespassers. This specific provision grants you as the sole active trustee absolute God-like power over the physical asset. You do not need a judge. You do not need a 30-day notice. I can dispatch a private security firm this afternoon to change every single lock on the doors box, up their personal belongings, and dump them into a rented storage unit. I absorbed his brilliant legal strategy, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the past 3 years finally begin to lift from my weary shoulders. But simply changing the brass locks and throwing their expensive designer clothes into a dusty storage locker was not nearly enough. They had casually discussed bulldozing my quiet home for a swimming pool. They viewed my sanctuary as nothing more than a disposable piece of dirt to be conquered. I looked across the desk at Victor, my voice devoid of emotion. I do not just want them legally locked out, I told him, speaking with slow, deliberate precision. I want to sell the entire estate. I want it liquidated immediately. When their luxury cruise ship finally docks and they desperately scramble back to Boston with their canceled credit cards and their frozen bank accounts. I do not want them to return to a locked house. I want them to return to a completely vacant lot. I want the property gone. I want to convert the structure back into raw cash and walk away, leaving them with absolutely nothing to claim, nowhere to sleep, and no remaining ties to my life. Victor stared at me for a very long moment, genuinely impressed by the sheer unyielding finality of my aggressive decision. He nodded once, a sharp motion. He turned his chair slightly and picked up the heavy receiver of his desk phone. If you want this sprawling property permanently liquidated before their cruise ship returns to the harbor, we cannot waste time listing it on the traditional residential market, Victor explained, as his fingers rapidly dialed a private number. We need a corporate buyer, someone who does not care about the custom wainscoting or the expensive quartz countertops you installed. We need an aggressive commercial developer who will buy the raw acreage for pure cash. Victor held the receiver to his ear, his sharp eyes never leaving mine. I know exactly who to call, he whispered, covering the mouthpiece with his palm. He is a ruthless commercial real estate magnate who specializes in purchasing large private estates, completely tearing them down to the foundation and building high-density luxury townhomes. He has the liquid capital to close the transaction in exactly 5 days. Victor removed his hand from the phone. The developer had just answered the call. Victor spoke into the heavy black receiver with a low, commanding tone, briefly outlining the vast acreage and the premium zoning classification of my residential estate. He did not mention the custom Italian marble or the sprawling gourmet kitchen. He strictly sold the raw, valuable dirt beneath the concrete foundation. After less than 3 minutes of rapid conversation, Victor placed the heavy phone back onto its cradle and looked directly across the desk at me. The developer was highly intrigued. His name was Julian Croft, a man notoriously famous in Boston commercial real estate circles for always moving with ruthless, immediate precision. Victor informed me that Julian was already in his personal vehicle, quickly rerouting his entire morning schedule to meet me at the property in exactly 1 hour. I thanked Victor for his swift, aggressive legal action, stood up from the expensive leather guest chair, and calmly walked out of the towering glass building. The long drive back to the silent estate felt remarkably different this time. The crushing, heavy anxiety that had intensely gripped my chest since discovering the forged lockbox documents was completely gone. It had been entirely replaced by a cold, singular focus. I was no longer a helpless victim waiting in the dark to be robbed by my own family. I was a professional man, actively initiating a controlled, strategic demolition. I pulled my battered work truck through the towering wrought iron gates of the property and parked near the pristine front entrance. I did not have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, a massive custom black pickup truck turned into the long driveway, its heavy tires crunching loudly against the decorative gravel. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the vehicle. Julian Croft wore a sharp, tailored suit without a tie, blending corporate wealth with the rough, practical energy of a construction site. We shook hands. His grip was firm, calloused, and entirely businesslike. I did not offer him a polite tour of the residence. I simply unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped aside, allowing him to conduct his own silent evaluation. Julian walked through the grand foyer, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the imported Italian marble tiles I had painstakingly paid for just 3 years ago. He did not pause to admire the grand crystal chandelier or run his hands along the custom wainscoting I had spent weeks installing on my aching knees. His eyes moved rapidly across the ceiling joints, measuring the load-bearing spans and calculating the total square footage of the physical footprint. He was not looking for a beautiful home to live in. He was looking for maximum density. He was looking at how many luxury townhomes he could realistically pack onto the sprawling, valuable acreage. We walked outside to the expansive backyard, passing the modest 600-square-foot guest house where I had quietly lived while funding their lavish lifestyle. Julian stopped at the edge of the perfectly manicured lawn and turned to face me. He did not waste my time with unnecessary negotiation tactics or polite real estate flattery. He stated his absolute terms with the same cold, calculating efficiency as Victor Lawson. The property possessed excellent zoning, but the existing structures were completely useless to his specific commercial vision. Julian looked me directly in the eye and offered me $1.4 million in pure, unencumbered cash. I felt a brief hollow pang in my chest. I had originally purchased this estate for $1.8 million. Accepting his offer meant taking an immediate devastating loss of $400,000. For a retired contractor living on a fixed pension, that amount of money was a staggering, life-altering deficit. But I also knew the absolute alternative. If I dragged this out through standard real estate channels fighting off Tyler and Megan, in a bitter, drawn-out civil court battle, I risked losing the entire property to the fraudulent home equity line of credit. I would rather lose $400,000 on my own terms than allow my treacherous son to steal a single dime of my remaining equity. I looked at Julian and accepted his offer without a single moment of hesitation. Julian did not smile. He simply nodded and immediately laid out the rigid, non-negotiable timeline required for such a rapid, massive cash transaction. He informed me that his legal team would push the title checks and closing documents through the local municipal system by the end of the business week. We would finalize the official sale in exactly 5 days. But this blinding speed came with a severe physical condition. Julian required the entire property to be completely vacant by Friday evening. He informed me that he had already secured the heavy municipal demolition permits for this specific zoning sector. He planned to bring his heavy excavation crews and massive diesel bulldozers onto the property first thing Monday morning. He was going to completely level the main house, tear down my guest house, and rip up the entire foundation to pour new concrete for his townhomes. If there was a single piece of furniture, a stray television, or a forgotten box of clothes left inside the structure, when his crews arrived, it would all be crushed and buried under tons of heavy rubble. I assured Julian that the house would be completely empty and swept entirely clean long before his heavy machinery ever breached the front gates. We walked back around to the wide, circular driveway. Julian reached into the cabin of his black truck, pulling out a thick, legal clipboard containing a preliminary binding letter of intent. He laid the heavy clipboard completely flat against the dark, polished hood of his vehicle and quickly signed his name across the bottom line. He handed the silver pen to me. I looked down at the dense legal text, feeling the warm morning sun beating against my back. This was the exact moment of no return. The very second the blue ink left this pen, Tyler and Megan would officially become homeless. Their massive, opulent sanctuary, the physical monument to their boundless greed and arrogant vanity, would be legally condemned to absolute destruction. They would return from their fraudulent luxury cruise clutching useless declined credit cards, only to find a vacant excavated dirt lot where their pristine million-dollar mansion once stood. I pressed the pen firmly against the paper, ensuring my authentic, heavy signature left a deep, permanent groove in the page. I handed the clipboard back to Julian. He shook my hand one final time, got into his truck, and drove away, leaving me standing completely alone in the silent driveway. I turned around and stared at the towering front facade of the 4,000-square-foot main house. A daunting, monumental reality slowly settled over my tired shoulders. I had exactly 48 hours to completely empty a massive residence filled with every single worldly possession my son and his greedy wife owned. I needed to rent several large commercial moving trucks, purchase thick packing tape, and buy dozens of heavy-duty industrial garbage bags immediately. The unforgiving countdown officially began. I did not waste time contacting delicate residential movers who would meticulously wrap fine china in protective bubble wrap. I needed brute force, and I needed it immediately. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a commercial logistics foreman I knew from my heavy construction days. He ran a crew of burly, no-nonsense freight haulers who typically cleared out foreclosed warehouses and abandoned industrial sites. I offered him triple his standard daily rate if he could get a 10-man crew and 2 massive box trucks to my estate within the hour. He did not ask any questions. 50 minutes later, the heavy rumble of diesel engines shook the quiet, manicured street as 2 battered yellow moving trucks backed into my long circular driveway. 10 massive men wearing heavy steel-toed boots and thick canvas work gloves piled out of the cabs carrying endless stacks of flattened cardboard boxes and heavy-duty packing tape. I unlocked the grand front doors and stepped into the sprawling, immaculate foyer, waving the foreman and his heavy crew inside. They stood for a brief moment, their dusty boots tracking dirt onto the imported Italian marble, looking slightly confused by the pristine catalog-ready interior of the luxury mansion. They were accustomed to hauling rusted machinery, not carrying velvet accent chairs and designer throw pillows. I walked directly to the center of the massive formal living room, planting my boots firmly on the custom-woven rug that Megan had agonized over for 3 entire weeks. I looked around at the pristine walls, the floating staircase, and the glittering crystal chandelier hanging high above our heads. Then I turned to face the waiting crew of hardened laborers. I pointed a thick finger at the expensive leather sofas, the glass coffee tables, and the custom mahogany dining set. Box it all, I instructed them, my voice echoing coldly off the high vaulted ceilings. I do not care if it wrinkles. I do not care if it gets scratched. I just want every single item out of this structure by tomorrow night. The foreman simply nodded, barking sharp orders to his men. The pristine museum-like quality of the house instantly vanished, replaced by the loud, chaotic symphony of industrial packing. Rolls of heavy brown tape shrieked as they were pulled across cardboard. Heavy boots thudded relentlessly up and down the floating staircase. I stood near the massive quartz kitchen island, watching as men casually tossed expensive silver flatware and delicate crystal wine glasses into heavy-duty plastic crates. They moved with a brutal mechanical efficiency, completely indifferent to the staggering financial cost of the luxury items they were rapidly boxing away. I walked down the wide hallway and stepped into the master bedroom suite. Two burly men were aggressively sweeping Megan's massive walk-in closet, grabbing entire armfuls of expensive designer silk dresses and tossing them roughly into the bottom of deep cardboard boxes. A mountain of imported leather shoes, handbags, and luxury accessories formed a chaotic pile on the hardwood floor. I turned away from the closet and walked toward the heavy oak dresser sitting near the large bay windows. Sitting on top of the polished wood resting next to a silver watch was a small, dusty cardboard box. It had clearly been pulled down from the attic recently, perhaps when they were searching for old financial documents. I flipped the cardboard lid open. Inside rested a small collection of tarnished brass baseball trophies and faded blue ribbons. They belonged to Tyler. I picked up a small, heavy trophy. The metal batter was frozen mid-swing. The engraved plaque at the base read, "Willow Creek Little League Most Valuable Player, 1998. I held the cold metal in my calloused hands, feeling an unexpected sharp pang of profound grief pierce through my hardened resolve. For a fleeting, agonizing second, I remembered the bright, smiling 10-year-old boy who had proudly handed me this very trophy. I remembered the boy who used to run out to my work truck every single evening, eager to help me carry my heavy tool belt into the house. I remembered the son I thought I had successfully raised to be a good, honorable man. But that brief, painful ghost of paternal love was instantly extinguished. As I looked at the tarnished brass, the glowing digital text messages I had captured from his computer monitor flashed vividly behind my eyes. I saw his arrogant, cowardly words promising to lock me inside a sterile state-run asylum. I saw his eager willingness to falsely declare his own father mentally incompetent. I remembered the cold, terrifying realization that he was fully prepared to strip away my fundamental human freedom, locking me in a heavily medicated memory care ward, simply to steal the equity from my property and buy a beachfront condominium for his greedy mother-in-law. The boy who had earned this baseball trophy was long dead. He had been entirely consumed by his own vanity, replaced by a ruthless, calculating stranger who viewed my life as nothing more than a disposable financial asset. I dropped the heavy brass trophy back into the cardboard box without a single ounce of hesitation. I pushed the box across the dresser, signaling for one of the passing laborers to throw it into the trash bags. For the next 36 hours, I ruthlessly directed the aggressive demolition of their personal sanctuary. We completely stripped the massive 4,000-square-foot house down to the bare painted drywall. Every designer lamp, every expensive rug, and every piece of modern art was unceremoniously packed, taped, and loaded into the cavernous bellies of the yellow box trucks. We did the exact same thing to my small, depressing guest house in the backyard, loading my few practical belongings into the back of my own pickup truck. By late Thursday afternoon, the sprawling estate was entirely vacant. The grand rooms were completely empty, echoing hollowly with the sound of my heavy work boots. The property was now merely a hollow wooden shell, patiently waiting for the heavy commercial bulldozers to arrive on Monday morning. I locked the mahogany front doors for the final time and climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, instructing the hauling foreman to follow me closely. We drove far away from the manicured, tree-lined streets of the wealthy residential suburbs. I led the two massive trucks deep into the gritty, neglected industrial sector of the city. I pulled into a sprawling, dilapidated self-storage facility surrounded by tall, rusted chain-link fencing and topped with jagged coils of razor wire. The asphalt parking lot was heavily cracked and completely overgrown with thick, green weeds. I walked into the dimly lit, cramped rental office and slapped my credit card onto the scratched laminate counter. I requested their largest, cheapest, non-climate-controlled outdoor unit. The apathetic clerk handed me a heavy brass padlock and a greasy gate code. I directed the massive trucks down a long, narrow alley. We rolled up the dented door and dumped every single box inside. I paid for exactly 1 month. I left the cramped rental office and walked back out into the harsh glare of the industrial park parking lot. The heavy metal door of the storage unit was securely locked and bolted, effectively sealing away the entirely hollow legacy of my son and his manipulative wife. The drive back to the expansive estate was incredibly long and unnervingly quiet. For the next 24 hours, I existed in a strange liminal state of absolute emotional detachment. I paced the empty, echoing halls of the massive main house, listening closely to the hollow sound of my own heavy work boots bouncing sharply off the bare, painted drywall. The interior silence was incredibly profound, almost physical, in its heavy, suffocating weight. The grand, sprawling residential mansion, a structure that was once stuffed completely to the ceiling with imported leather furniture, delicate crystal vases, and wildly expensive designer vanities, now felt exactly like a massive, abandoned cavern waiting for inevitable collapse. I spent the remainder of the long Thursday afternoon and evening meticulously sweeping the vast expanses of polished hardwood floors. I systematically walked through every single room, checking inside every closet and every cabinet, ensuring that absolutely nothing of material or sentimental value was left behind. I deliberately wanted to hand the physical property over to the commercial developer in a pristine, completely sterile condition, entirely devoid of any lingering human presence. By early Friday afternoon, the final irreversible stage of my methodical financial demolition was officially set into motion. I drove my truck directly into the busy downtown district, to a highly secure private conference room located deep within the corporate offices of a premium title company. Victor Lawson sat to my immediate right, his posture rigidly straight and thoroughly professional. Julian Croft, the aggressive commercial developer, sat directly across from us, flanked on both sides by his own intimidating team of sharp corporate attorneys. The overall atmosphere inside the quiet room was entirely transactional, completely devoid of any lingering sentimentality, familial nostalgia, or personal hesitation. Thick stacks of dense, highly complicated legal paperwork were systematically passed across the vast expanse of the polished mahogany table. I smoothly signed immediate deed transfers, signed absolute waivers of future liability, and initialed multiple binding commercial sales contracts. My hand moved gracefully with steady mechanical precision across every single page. There was absolutely no hesitation in my mind when I officially relinquished all the remaining legal rights to the sprawling estate that I had originally purchased with a grueling lifetime of hard physical labor. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Julian's lead corporate attorney nodded silently to a junior associate sitting near the window, who then formally initiated the final electronic bank wire transfer. My smartphone vibrated sharply in my heavy jacket pocket just a few short minutes later. I calmly pulled the digital device out and securely opened my newly established banking application. The glowing digital screen instantly illuminated, displaying the details of a completely isolated, highly encrypted financial account. The numerical balance instantly refreshed right before my eyes. Exactly $1.4 million in pure, unencumbered, untraceable cash had just successfully cleared the complex federal wire system. The massive real estate transaction was fully and legally complete. The staggering amount of money was now entirely safe, resting utterly untouchable by the greedy, fraudulent hands of my treacherous son and his conniving wife. I stood up from the comfortable leather chair, firmly shook Julian's calloused hand across the table, and quietly walked out of the corporate conference room. I immediately drove my battered truck back out to the suburban estate for the very last time. The warm, late-afternoon sun was just beginning to dip significantly lower in the western sky, casting incredibly long, golden shadows across the completely empty acreage of the property. I carefully parked my heavy work truck directly in front of the small, highly modest guest house, perfectly nestled in the quiet rear corner of the expansive property line. This tiny, simple structure had been my only true quiet sanctuary for the past 3 agonizing years. I did not require the services of a brutal commercial moving crew to carefully handle my own personal belongings. I methodically and quietly packed my sturdy green canvas duffel bags with my neatly folded worn denim jeans, my heavy plaid flannel shirts, and my practical, mud-stained work boots. I carefully and lovingly boxed up my extensive, highly valued collection of specialized carpentry tools, meticulously ensuring that every single metal piece was properly oiled and safely secured for a long journey. It took me less than 1 full hour to completely load everything I truly owned into the covered metal bed of my pickup truck. My entire remaining life fit neatly and perfectly into the back of a single motorized vehicle. It was a stark, incredibly profound contrast to the sprawling, ridiculous mountains of designer luxury trash that I had violently crammed into the dark belly of that sketchy, unregulated storage unit. I firmly closed and locked the heavy metal tailgate, turning around slowly to look back at the grand, towering, and completely empty mansion one final time. Right on scheduled time, the deep, heavy rattling roar of massive diesel engines violently shattered the quiet, peaceful tranquility of the wealthy suburban neighborhood. A massive, intimidating convoy of industrial flatbed trucks, heavy equipment haulers, and large commercial crew vans turned sharply and aggressively into the long, paved circular driveway. Julian Croft had absolutely not wasted a single second of his precious schedule. His dedicated commercial demolition crew had arrived precisely as he had promised, incredibly eager to immediately prep the residential site for Monday morning's total, merciless excavation. Dozens of burly men wearing bright yellow high-visibility safety vests and heavy white hard hats instantly spilled out of the parked vans. They immediately unspooled incredibly thick rolls of heavy-gauge steel wire and began rapidly driving thick metal construction posts deep into the soft perimeter dirt of the yard. Within just a few short minutes, a crude, highly imposing 6-foot-tall chain-link construction fence was erected completely around the pristine, valuable front boundary of the entire estate. Thick, heavy canvas banners prominently bearing the bold, highly aggressive corporate logo of Julian's commercial real estate development firm were strapped tightly to the metal fence links. The loud banners proudly and legally announced the imminent total destruction of the residential property. Wealthy neighbors peacefully walking their expensive, highly groomed purebred dogs immediately stopped dead on the pristine concrete sidewalks, staring in absolute unadulterated shock as the rapid, brutal industrial takeover unfolded violently right before their startled eyes. The incredibly visceral, undeniable climax of the late afternoon officially arrived with a loud, shrieking mechanical hiss of heavy commercial air brakes. A massive, incredibly oversized industrial flatbed trailer backed slowly and carefully up to the grand front entrance of the estate, securely carrying a colossal bright yellow commercial demolition bulldozer. The skilled truck operator quickly unlatched the heavy rusted securing chains and loudly lowered the thick steel transport ramps to the pavement. The solid ground physically trembled beneath my boots as the massive, heavy metal treads of the enormous bulldozer rolled violently down onto the paved driveway. The focused operator confidently steered the colossal yellow machine directly onto the exact center of the highly prized, perfectly manicured front lawn. The incredibly heavy steel tracks instantly tore deep, violent, muddy gashes directly into the pristine, lush green turf, brutally and effortlessly crushing the delicate, expensive floral landscaping that Megan had agonizingly obsessed over for many long, miserable months. The massive scraped steel demolition blade finally came to a complete, shuddering rest, just a few short yards away from the grand mahogany front doors. It was a silent, incredibly menacing, and totally undeniable promise of the absolute structural devastation officially scheduled for Monday dawn. I slowly walked over to the newly erected metal chain-link gate, firmly pulling the heavy metal wire sections closely together. I forcefully snapped an incredibly thick, solid brass padlock firmly into place, officially securing the perimeter, and wordlessly handed the single jagged silver key directly to Julian's waiting clipboard, holding site manager. I did not bother to look back at the doomed house again. I calmly climbed up into the comfortable, worn driver's seat of my trusted truck, turned the reliable ignition, and slowly pulled out onto the quiet, affluent street. I smoothly merged onto the busy southbound interstate highway, setting my steady, unwavering course down the incredibly long, scenic coastal highway directly toward the warm, welcoming, and beautifully quiet sandy beaches of South Carolina. I tightly gripped the worn leather steering wheel, listening calmly to the steady, rhythmic hum of the powerful engine, simply and peacefully, waiting in absolute unbroken silence for the inevitable, violently explosive phone call. 14 days is a remarkably short amount of time to completely erase a lifetime of physical attachments, but it is more than enough time to find a deep, abiding sense of peace. I sat on the spacious wooden balcony of a beautiful luxury rental property overlooking the pristine coastline of Charleston, South Carolina. The warm, salty ocean breeze drifted lazily through the open glass doors, carrying the faint, rhythmic sound of crashing waves. I lifted a ceramic mug to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of hot black coffee. The bitter, robust flavor grounded me in the quiet reality of my new life. It was a beautiful, cloudless Tuesday morning. Back in Boston, the massive steel teeth of a commercial bulldozer were officially scheduled to tear into the foundation of my former estate in exactly 2 hours. Resting on the glass patio table beside my coffee mug, my cellular phone suddenly vibrated, the screen lighting up with yet another missed call notification. The device had been ringing continuously, relentlessly for the past 24 hours. I had patiently watched the digital chaos unfold from a comfortable distance, observing the frantic, inevitable collapse of their European fantasy. The initial signs of their total financial destruction had actually begun 2 days ago. I had intentionally left my voicemail inbox completely open, acting as a passive, silent receptacle for their mounting panic. The very first audio message was from Megan. Her voice had sounded slightly annoyed, laced with that familiar, arrogant entitlement. She had angrily complained that my emergency platinum card was unexpectedly declining at a high-end designer boutique in Milan. She demanded that I immediately contact the bank to authorize the overseas transaction, clearly assuming I was just sitting obediently in my quiet guest house, eagerly waiting to facilitate her luxurious shopping spree. 3 hours later, the tone of the incoming voicemails had drastically shifted from petty annoyance to genuine, unadulterated terror. Tyler had called repeatedly, leaving frantic, breathless recordings. He explained that the luxury Tuscan resort had abruptly locked them out of their expensive suite. The hotel concierge had politely but firmly demanded alternative payment for their exorbitant $1,500 a night room charges. When Tyler attempted to access their joint checking accounts, he discovered they were completely frozen. When he desperately tried to check the status of the massive home equity loan, he was met with a terrifying automated alert stating that his account was under active federal investigation for severe felony fraud. They had been stranded, thousands of miles away from their comfortable stolen security, with absolutely no access to liquid capital. Their fraudulent fairy tale had rapidly mutated into a terrifying nightmare. I listened to a dozen more voicemails tracking their humiliating, desperate scramble to escape Italy. Tyler had practically begged his wealthy artificial friends for temporary wire transfers. Megan had sobbed hysterically into the receiver, screaming that her demanding mother flatly refused to cover the massive last-minute international airfare. They were ultimately forced to sell Megan's expensive designer luggage and several pieces of high-end jewelry to a local pawnbroker just to secure 2 miserable economy-class seats on a connecting flight back to the United States. I sat on the peaceful southern balcony, absorbing the sheer poetic justice of their miserable journey. They had attempted to strip away my entire livelihood to fund their extravagant vanity, and they had ultimately been reduced to pawning their stolen luxuries just to crawl back home. But the true, absolute climax of their humiliating return had only just occurred late last night. The final sequence of audio recordings painted a vivid, highly satisfying picture of their arrival back in Boston. After a grueling, incredibly stressful international flight, they had been forced to hire a cheap, heavily dented airport taxi to drive them back to the wealthy suburban neighborhood. I could easily envision the entire pathetic scene. They would have been completely exhausted, wearing the exact same wrinkled clothes, They had frantically traveled and desperately eager to simply walk through the grand mahogany doors of their pristine mansion and hide from the catastrophic financial ruin closing in around them. Instead, the small taxi would have slowly pulled up to a property that no longer resembled a residential sanctuary. The very first voicemail from that specific moment was nothing but pure, unfiltered shock. Tyler had called, his voice trembling so violently I could barely understand his frantic words. He stammered uncontrollably about a massive, 6-foot-tall chain-link fence completely surrounding the entire perimeter of the property. He breathlessly described the heavy, imposing canvas banners strapped tightly to the metal wire, prominently displaying the highly aggressive corporate logo of a massive commercial real estate developer. Megan's hysterical screaming vividly echoed in the background of that specific audio recording. She was loudly demanding to know why the grand, sprawling house was completely dark and entirely devoid of life. She shrieked that the custom silk curtains were inexplicably gone, that the expensive crystal chandeliers had vanished from the ceilings, and that the interior looked entirely hollow. The massive 4,000-square-foot mansion they had proudly paraded on social media platforms was now nothing more than an empty, abandoned wooden shell. But the most devastating physical blow was parked directly in the center of the yard. Tyler's voice cracked into a high, panicked pitch as he described the colossal, bright yellow commercial bulldozer resting violently on top of the ruined, muddy grass. The heavy steel demolition blade was pointed directly at the front doors, a terrifying, silent promise of the absolute destruction officially scheduled for the very next morning. They had stood shivering on the cold concrete sidewalk, completely locked out by heavy brass padlocks, staring in absolute horror at the loud, undeniable warning signs that their physical home was scheduled for total commercial demolition. They left dozens of screaming voicemails throughout the night, begging me to explain what was happening, demanding to know where their expensive belongings were located, and threatening absurd legal action. I listened to the mounting despair, feeling absolutely no pity, no regret, and no hesitation. They had planned to erase my existence, and I erased their privileged world in 5 business days. The estate was officially sold. The cash was sitting safely in an encrypted, untouchable account. All of their personal possessions were rotting away in a cheap storage unit inside a neglected industrial park. They had absolutely nothing left to return to. They had no home, no money, and a looming federal fraud investigation hovering over their arrogant heads. I took another slow, satisfying sip of my black coffee. The persistent vibration of my cellular phone finally stopped. The screen went dark for a few brief, peaceful seconds. Then it suddenly lit up once again, however. This call was not displaying familiar mobile numbers. The screen displayed an unknown random local area code. It was clearly a disposable burner phone purchased in a desperate attempt to bypass my call-blocking features. I placed the mug down. I picked up the digital device. I took one deep breath of salty ocean air, preparing myself for the inevitable explosive confrontation, and pressed accept. The audio connection finally engaged, and immediately the chaotic sounds of a blustery Boston morning poured through the small speaker of my mobile device. I could clearly hear the heavy rush of city traffic and the distinct, powerful rumble of the massive yellow commercial bulldozer idling forcefully in the background. It was a beautiful mechanical symphony of absolute, undeniable destruction. Above that industrial noise, the frantic, panicked breathing of my son echoed loudly into my ear. He was hyperventilating, his voice cracking, with a level of sheer, unadulterated primal terror I had never once heard from him in his entire privileged 35 years of life. Dad Tyler screamed into the receiver, completely abandoning any pretense of his usual arrogant composure. "Dad, where are you?" "We just got back from the airport, and the house is completely locked down. There is a massive metal fence built entirely around the perimeter. The locks are gone. There is a giant bulldozer parked right in the middle of the front lawn, and guys in hard hats are telling us we are trespassing." "What is going on? What did you do?" I did not interrupt his frantic, breathless interrogation. I simply sat back in my comfortable wooden deck chair, resting the warm ceramic coffee mug on my knee, and allowed him to fully exhaust his initial wave of blind panic. When he finally stopped screaming to take a ragged, desperate breath, I replied. My voice was perfectly calm, completely steady, perfectly flat, and utterly devoid of any paternal warmth. It was the precise, measured tone of a professional businessman concluding a highly successful corporate transaction. I sold my property. Tyler, I stated clearly, letting the absolute finality of the words sink deeply into his frantic mind. I liquidated the entire estate yesterday afternoon to a commercial developer. Your designer furniture, your expensive clothes, and every single one of your worldly belongings are currently sitting in a cheap, unheated space at Unit 42 at the East Side Industrial Storage Facility. The entrance gate code is your 4-digit birth year exactly. I prepaid the monthly rental fee for exactly 30 full days, so I highly suggest you retrieve your trash before they publicly auction it off. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the cellular connection. I could practically hear the gears inside his head violently grinding as he desperately tried to comprehend the staggering magnitude of his new reality. He stammered, attempting to formulate a cohesive sentence, but I swiftly cut him off before he could speak another word. And Tyler, I continued, my tone dropping to a sharp, icy register. You should expect a highly formal phone call later this afternoon. The National Fraud Division of my bank, along with several federal investigators, will be contacting you directly regarding a completely forged home equity line of credit application. They are incredibly eager to discuss the fraudulent $600,000 lien you attempted to illegally place against my revocable living trust, as well as the corrupt public notary you used to authenticate my ghost. I have already provided them with the extensive digital photographic evidence of your private group chat. I strongly suggest you retain a highly competent criminal defense attorney immediately today. There was a sharp, sudden scuffle on the other end of the line, followed by the muffled sound of the mobile device changing hands. The shrill, piercing voice of Megan instantly assaulted my eardrum. The carefully constructed, polite facade she had maintained for years was entirely gone, completely replaced by the vicious, screeching desperation of a cornered predator, realizing its trap had violently snapped shut on its own leg. "You monster!" Megan shrieked into the phone, her voice echoing wildly over the idling diesel engine of the bulldozer. "How could you do this to us? We have absolutely no money. Our bank accounts are frozen. Our credit cards are entirely declined. We had to sell my diamond tennis bracelet to a disgusting pawn shop just to fly home. Where are we supposed to live? You cannot just throw us out onto the street." I slowly lifted my ceramic mug to my lips and took a long, incredibly satisfying sip of my hot black coffee. I looked out over the vast, sparkling expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, watching a small white sailboat glide peacefully across the distant blue horizon. The absolute contrast between the tranquil beauty of my physical environment and the hysterical misery radiating from the phone speaker was incredibly profound. I waited exactly 3 seconds before delivering the final definitive strike. "Why do you not go live with your parents, Megan?" I asked smoothly, letting a faint trace of genuine amusement bleed into my calm voice. "You stated very clearly in your private messages that you only wanted to secure a luxurious beachfront property for your demanding mother. You specifically told her that you wanted nothing more than to be with your own true family, while locking me away in a state-run asylum. I just granted your ultimate wish. Enjoy your new life." I did not wait to hear her inevitable screaming response. I pressed the red button on the digital screen, permanently severing the cellular connection. I forcefully removed the protective plastic casing from the back of the mobile device and pulled out the tiny golden cellular subscriber identity module card. I placed the fragile electronic chip flat onto the sturdy wooden railing of the balcony, picked up my heavy steel pocket knife, and forcefully crushed the card into dozens of useless, shattered metallic fragments. I casually brushed the broken plastic dust over the edge of the railing, watching it flutter harmlessly down into the ocean breeze. I settled deeply into my chair, letting the warm sun wash over my face. For the first time in 3 years, my chest felt completely light. I was free. I was unburdened from the parasitic weight of the people I foolishly trusted. I possessed over $1 million resting safely in an impenetrable account, completely beyond their reach. I had the absolute undeniable freedom to spend the remainder of my long life exactly as I saw fit. I began to quietly formulate my brand new future. I planned to travel visiting national parks I never found time to see while working to fund their ungrateful lives. Afterward, I intended to purchase small plots of land. I would proudly use my own 2 hands to build modest homes for disabled military veterans. I had finally survived the most profound, devastating betrayal of my entire life by relying entirely on the fundamental practical mindset of a highly experienced veteran structural contractor. When you inspect a building and discover that the foundation is completely rotten, consumed by structural decay and hidden termites, you do not ever waste your valuable time applying a fresh coat of expensive paint. You do not try to desperately patch the crumbling drywall or politely ignore the deeply infected framework. You evacuate the premises, you bring in the heavy machinery, and you ruthlessly tear the entire house down to the bare dirt. You completely obliterate the highly toxic structure, clear away the debris, and calmly begin building something entirely new. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to exploit you. As parents, we spend our lives building foundations to keep our children safe, but sometimes the people we raise become the very ones trying to tear us down. I learned that you cannot fix a rotten structure with fresh paint. You have to bulldoze it and start over. Real family is built entirely on respect, not toxic entitlement. Do not ever let your love for your children blind you to the reality of their actions. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let them face brutal consequences. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to protect your own sanity? It is the hardest choice a person can make. Hit the like button if you agree with how I handled it, subscribe for more stories, and leave a comment sharing your personal experience.